what was envisioned in 1947, 48. And I know people are going to throw in the Balfour Declaration. They're going to talk about Theodore Herzl and colonialism and all that. Yes, history is complicated, guys. It really is complicated. There ain't nothing black and white in this world. It's complicated. But the world made a decision that the state of Israel will exist. And I can get behind that. I can support the existence of the state of Israel. Russia is going to impose its will on Ukraine and on Ukraine's Western allies. Russia has always made it clear that not only will it regain control of the totality of Kherson, including the right bank, Zaporizhia, Donetsk, and Lugansk, but that Russia is going to seek to have a buffer zone. And if Ukraine isn't going to willingly hand over the territory necessary to create this buffer zone, Russia will seize it through military force. This is what Russia has said all along. They warned you, when you start using long-range weapons to strike Russian territory, all you're doing is guaranteeing that the buffer zone that we're going to create is going to be even bigger. And this is why demilitarization is so important too. It's not just about the size of the Ukrainian military that will be permitted in a post-conflict environment, but the composition of this military, what weapons it will have. Ukraine will not be allowed to have any weapons capable of striking Russian territory. Ukraine lost that right. It started this conflict. It sought to escalate this conflict, and now it's lost this conflict. And that's the way the cookie crumbles. There's no concern on the part of Russia. Russia's not concerned by any of this. Russia doesn't care. Russia didn't ask for this. It's not Russia that went to the United States and says, please intercede because we're in a tough position right here and we really need your help to bring an end to this conflict, and we're willing to do whatever's necessary to make that happen. Russia never said that. Trump said, I want this war to end. Why? Because America's lost this war. That's the reality. Let's put it in the proper context of Navalny. Navalny is a CIA-created resource. I mean, he's an ultra-right-wing lunatic who was basically brought into power. People need to study how Navalny came into being, because he's this nut job. He's a guy who literally talks about calling the people of the Caucasus cockroaches and that the solution is to shoot them. Nice guy, Mr. Democracy here. But he was empowered because he could help create a youth movement that the West wanted to replicate what happened in Ukraine. The Orange Revolution was, again, a CIA, George Soros-sponsored coup to get rid of Viktor Yanukovych, who won the election, not once, but twice, but they illegally and unconstitutionally ran it a third time to keep him out, brought in Yushchenko, who's an ultra-nationalist. The first thing he did was make Stepan Bandera a national hero. People forget this. The Russians don't. But Navalny was supposed to replicate this, and the CIA backed him. He was brought to the United States. He was sponsored by this Russian academic who had this sort of a think tank type this salon that she ran in Moscow, where she brought in Gary Kasparov, another MI6 CIA resource, Nemtsov. The whole crew came in here, and she sponsored them and reported back to the U.S. Embassy because she was a CIA student. She was, I forget which universities she was working at here in the United States, Brown maybe or something, but she was recruited there, trained there, sent to Russia to do this job. She's now back here because she's a spy. She's literally a CIA resource. Navalny was CIA. The whole movement, democracy movement, was CIA controlled. They either did it directly through their officers in the U.S. Embassy, or they did it through proxies, through the NGOs. It's amazing, in 2012, when Russia kicked out USAID and all the other NGOs, everybody went, oh my God, how anti-democratic can you be? Today, who's saying that? We now know what the truth of USAID and NED and all these others are. We know what they do. A war means the physical destruction of Ukraine. A war means Kiev no longer exists. Lvov no longer exists. That's what a war is. It's a war. A war is an existential struggle between two nations. It's total war, where it's people against the people, and you're seeking to physically destroy something. Russia's not seeking the physical destruction of Ukraine. If it was, Ukraine would be physically destroyed. This is a special military operation, which means that even if, as Russia brings to bear an increasing level of military violence to solve problems on the battlefield, that's only, again, in reaction to the investment made by the West. So Russia's level of violence rises as the West invests, but this is not war. Because if it was war, Ukraine would no longer exist. That's the reality of it. So we need to keep that in mind. And it's something the Russians continuously remind the Ukrainians. For instance, they say if you make a move on Transnistria, that will become a war. if you start striking critical Russian infrastructure. People say that Crimea bridge is a legitimate target because Russia brings military equipment across. And the Russians are saying it's a legitimate target in war, but we're not at war. But if you want to attack that and destroy that, then we will be at war. First of all, the United States doesn't have any say in this whatsoever. It's purely a Russian internal policy that dates back whatever is in Putin's heart. But I think in 2005, he gave an address to the Senate, and I forget what they called, the Federated Council or something like that. This is the speech that's been taken out of context, where he said that the greatest geopolitical calamity of the last century was the collapse of the Soviet Union. And everybody went, oh my God, he wants to remake the Soviet Union. Well, you don't listen to what he says. He said, because overnight, tens of millions of Russians became homeless. And he said, I am the president of the Russian nation. That's different from the Russian Federation. The Russian nation is the Russian people united by a common language, culture, religion, history. And these people live in places today that aren't part of the Russian Federation, but I have a duty and responsibility to them. And so this is what defines Russian policy and will continue to define Russian policy. And there's nothing the United States can do to get involved in this. This is purely a domestic affair. Russia will work with the nations as needed. Russia's not going to invade, but people need to understand that Russia will not give up, that it's there to protect its citizens. And if those nations decide to do things to create the potential for military conflict, and again, I hate being nitpicky on this, and I'm not picking on you. It's not a war. And if that hasn't become obvious to everybody, they would, again, if the United States can pull it off, get the Ukrainians to agree to everything, get Europe to back down, Russia will sign on to that. Why not? But the idea that Russia is going to yield anything to the United States is absurd in the extreme. They will yield nothing. This was a conflict of existential proportions thrust upon them by Ukraine and the West, including Donald Trump's United States. Russia won the war. Anybody who doesn't think Russia's winning the war probably should never, ever again discuss geopolitical things or military things. There's no one out there can articulate any plausible outcome from this conflict other than a decisive Russian victory. That's the direction we're heading. For Europe to try and put more resources into this will only further bankrupt Europe. And understand that the concept of a European security framework is a larger discussion, a larger dialogue that Russia has linked to this conflict. In fact, that was the first thing Russia wanted to talk about before going to war, is European security framework. Imagine if NATO had said, yeah, we'd like to responsibly engage with you back in December of 2021. And yeah, we understand Ukraine will never be a member of NATO. We got that. What would have happened? Kherson, Zaporizhia would be Ukrainian. Donetsk and Lugansk would have had a referendum. Who knows what that outcome would have been, but it would have been an outcome that would not have cost any more lives. Hundreds of billions of dollars wouldn't have been wasted. Millions of lives wouldn't have been lost. And now you've got Europe scrambling to, what is JD smoking? Last I checked, Modi was going to be in Moscow on May 9th, not in Washington, D.C. Look, India's playing a difficult game. They're straddling the fence on here. But they are part of BRICS, and that BRICS relationship is solid. What the United States is trying to do is drive a wedge between India and China. I always crack up. Last time I checked, it wasn't China that had carrier battle groups roaming the Indo-Pacific. It was the United States. So there's only one power that seeks to dominate the region through military force, and that's the United States. So the hypocrisy that's contained in that statement is unreal. Also, last time I checked, India gets the majority of its military equipment from Russia, or at least a significant part of it, to include S-400 missiles. How's that going to work, America, if they're on par with all these other people? But India's buying S-400 missiles. They're buying advanced Russian aircraft, advanced Russian systems. There's just a lot of wishful thinking there on the part of J.D. Vance. It's a strategy that the strategy is predicated, the American strategy is predicated on the ability to strip India away from China. That's just not going to happen, because India understands that China is a growing power. And the best way to deal with China is through cooperation, not through confrontation. And India is not going to get into the confronting China business. And I think this is the wrong approach for the United States to be taking. Leading with the military is just a recipe for failure and disaster, because while the American military remains dominant, it isn't there's a difference in when you talk about, for instance, air superiority and air supremacy. Air superiority means you got the upper hand, but you're still fighting. Air supremacy means you can go anywhere and do what you want. Right now in the Pacific, we have military superiority. But if you take a look at trends, our trend is towards lessening. Our military is pretty much capped out at what it can do. And to increase it, we'd have to invest considerably, and we're not in a position to make that investment right now. China, on the other hand, we see their military continuing to grow, to get stronger. So the superiority that we currently enjoy is starting to see the Chinese each reach parity. So instead of being superior across the board, we're superior here, but the Chinese have reached parity in many places, and in some places the Chinese achieve superiority, broken through, and they have superiority in hypersonic missiles, for instance, which means that any conflict between the United States and China, but it also means you have to support the existence of a state called Palestine as an equal state. How we get these two entities to be created, it's a problem, big problem. But you can't even engage in that problem set when Israel is manifested in its current structure, where it's talking about a greater Israel. The greater Israel is a game changer. You can't support greater Israel. That means that if Israel says our existence is predicated on a greater Israel, that means that your existence is no longer justifiable. If you define yourself in terms of greater Israel, not 1947 or even 1960s, but this collapse could be managed in a different way. See, if you're seeking the existential erasure of Israel through collapse, then you're going to have to sacrifice the Palestinian people. That's just the way it's going to be. You're sacrificing. So let's just be honest out there for all those people on the Palestinian people's side. You're willing to sacrifice them. That's what you're saying, that you want this resistance to continue so that Israel continues to be constrained, to bring about the potential collapse of Israel down the road. But in order to do that, the violence has to be sustained against Gaza to justify this. And you want more dead Palestinian children. Just admit it, be honest. You want to sacrifice to Palestine. I'm hopeful that the Russians and the Chinese will work with the Iranians to keep them on course, keep Iran on track, and get a framework agreement that everybody recognizes accomplishes the goal of bringing Iran down from a nuclear threshold power, and yet allowing Iran to retain pride, sovereignty, etc. And then we can have an intervention where you put Trump into a room and everybody comes in and goes, guys, this is the best damn thing in the world. This is it. And you're a hero if you do this. But if you go back to that abusive partner, the ex, this all goes away. What Israel are we talking about? Because you can't support the continued existence of a genocidal entity. You can't support the continued dominance of a people who view everybody else in terms of Amalek, the human animals who can easily be killed, and their deaths can be justified because of Israeli ethnic religious supremacy. That nation doesn't deserve to exist. If Israel is a nation state that recognizes it as one of equals in the region, I can defend that. All this warlike talk, and they believe NATO's there to back them up. NATO's not there to back them up anymore. And pretty soon, NATO won't even be there to make a pretense of backing them up. They'll be totally isolated. And when that happens, I think you'll see they'll have to make adjustments. Russia's not going to invade the Baltics unless the Baltics do something stupid, try a naval blockade against Russia, try to isolate Kaliningrad. Then that's the end of the Baltics. And again, because of this conflict, Article 5 protection is no longer what it once was. Trump isn't going to send America off to fight and die in war against Russia if the Baltics create a crisis of their own making. They're on their own. In a European army that wants to come to but how are they going to get there? I think you're going to see that the Russians will continue this policy of defending the Russian nation, but nothing Steve Witkoff can bring to the table, because that was the original question, is can Witkoff have any, it's not even going to be brought up. It's none of his business.